Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. We're excited to share the latest research from our African American transfer tipping point about what students said. We always love to share students' words, what they share with us. It's really important. Thank you. So it's not just Katie and me from the RP group, but we are honored to be joined by Dr. Elliott Coney, who is the counseling coordinator at LA Valley College, and our Umoja alumna, Crystal Gitonga, who is also an Umoja board member and an Umoja UCR graduate and a graduate student, and just a wonderful success story. So we're really looking forward to hearing from both of them about their experiences and thoughts. But let's go ahead and jump in. So we're going to give a very brief overview of what got us to this project. For those of you who may not be familiar, again, there were many phases to this project. For those of you who've been with us the entire time, I thank you. We appreciate you. But we're going to try to do a very brief recap. If you see something interesting, the previous webinars are on our website. You can always go back and watch those. The earlier reports are also there, and we'll share some links to those as well as we go through the program. But once we do the recap, we're going to go into the new information in terms of what students say their transfer tipping point is. And then, again, I said we're going to conclude with a bit of discussion from Dr. Coney and from Crystal around these latest findings and what the implications may be. Next slide, please. So just in case you're not familiar with the RP group, the Research and Planning Group for California Community Colleges, we are an independent nonprofit that is the membership organization for the researchers and planners that work across the 116 California community colleges. And we also conduct research, like what we're going to share with you today. And we also offer professional development for not just researchers, but for the entire field around the topics of research, development, and professional development and leadership development. All right, next slide. So all of this started with a study. I can't believe it's been like 10 years since we started with Through the Gate. On the next slide, just a very kind of quick overview. The project looked at students who had met all or most of their transfer requirements, but then did not go on to transfer. And in doing that study, one of the findings when we disaggregated by race ethnicity was that we found that if African American students can make it to that near the gate status, which means you have 60 units, 60 transferable units, and you have a 2.0, but you may or may not have taken your math and English requirements. If Black students get to that point, they are the group that is most likely to transfer. When we look at students from freshmen, basically 0 units, they unfortunately are often the least likely to transfer. So something's happening between 0 and 60 units that really kind of flips the script for our African American and Black students, making them the most likely to transfer among all ethnicities and races. So with that finding, we said, we need to dig into this a little bit more. And that is the genesis of our African American transfer tipping point study. So I believe this is where I hand it over to Katie to get us started with the quick recap of what we've shared to date.
Yes, and at the very end of the presentation today, we will pepper you with links and QR codes. So if folks on this call today are new to the African American Transfer Tipping Point Project, you can get all caught up to speed. This really is just the Cliff's Notes version, really quickly to get everyone set up for the newer research that we're going to be sharing today. But holistically speaking, the African American Transfer Tipping Point study, which was funded by the Lumina Foundation, is really designed to explore broadly what factors, both academic and non-academic, contribute to African American and Black students' likelihood of reaching that tipping point. So going back to what Dr. Cooper said, at some point along the way, African American and Black students become the most likely to make it through the gate. But we're trying to figure out what's going on earlier before they get near the gate that might be impacting their ultimate persistence and success. And so we want to explore what are the programs and practices associated with greater persistence, both to and then, of course, through the transfer gate. All right, and so just a quick refresher, the very first phase of this work, which started in late 2020, was focused on looking at students' course taking patterns, so really digging quantitatively into the data to look at factors that are available to explore from a system-wide perspective. And then from that, we were able to identify some core factors that we believed influenced African American and Black students' transfer success. But of course, this is all behind the scenes in the data, and you need to speak to students themselves. And so what we did was we identified a subset of colleges across the California community college system that were having disproportionately better success when it came to transfer among their African American and Black student population. And at those colleges, we conducted focus groups with students and interviews with administrators who the college identified as being key to supporting Black student success at that college. So in some cases, it was a transfer director, but not necessarily so. And then from those interviews and focus groups, we were able to identify some additional factors that were not available in the extant data sets. And then, because of course that was just a snapshot of the data, we then conducted a statewide survey of African American and Black students across all of the California community colleges. And there's a whole report on that, data from over 7,000 students from across each of the colleges. I think we had participation from at least 3 students at 116 of the 116 colleges. Okay, so if you take anything away from phase 1 of the African American Transfer Tipping Point study, it is this figure, which we actually turned into an infographic this year that we'll share at the end and share a QR code for. Hopefully, the majority of folks on this call have seen this figure, but what it's really trying to drive home are the factors that influence the likelihood that a Black student makes it near the transfer gate. And so what you can see here in these arrows are the change in likelihood that is associated with a given factor. So if we start right up here, this long arrow, so this is saying that an African American or Black student who passes both transfer level English and math in their first year at their college is 310% more likely to get near the transfer gate than a Black student who does not pass transfer level English and math in the first year. Now, if a student passes transfer level math but not English in the first year, still great. It increases their likelihood by 160%. If they pass transfer level English but not math, not as great, but still pretty great. It's going to increase your chances by 70%. If an African American or Black student receives academic counseling, they are 60% more likely to make it near the transfer gate than if they do not. And now for these other factors, I want to stress something. Even though they look small relative to the other bars, that's just because this is so incredibly important. But from a statistically significant perspective, from a practically significant perspective, these aren't very important. So if a student participates in Umoja, they're 20% more likely to make it near the gate. And then these bars on the flip side are showing factors that reduce the likelihood of a student making it near the gate. So low-income students and disabled students are 20% less likely to make it near the gate. And then here you see if a student is put on academic probation at any point in their time at the college, they are 70% less likely to make it near the gate. I want to just point something out from a statistical perspective. When you're moving in the positive direction, the degree to which you can increase is the limit does not exist, right? You can be 500% more likely, 600% more likely, but when you move into the negative, you can't be more than 100% less likely. So this bar, 70%, is huge, okay? And just one more thing that I want to point out before I go on to the next is that revisiting this finding around academic counseling. So it seems amazing, right? If you receive academic counseling as a Black student, you're 60% more likely to make it near the gate. However, what I'm not showing here is non-Black students. A non-Black student who receives academic counseling is 110% more likely to make it near the gate. So then a question exists, what is going on with respect to the impact of counseling? Okay, that was the, hopefully 3-minute version of phase 1, but I encourage everyone to go check out that report. But then, of course, we wanted to understand why the factors that I just showed on the previous slide were important. And so this led to that second phase of the project that I mentioned where we conducted focus groups and interviews. And I'm just going to summarize it here. When it came to passing math and English, so those really long bars we saw on the previous slide, what students were saying was that faculty helped them build their confidence as students and increase their mastery of key subjects and support their success. So it's both an academic and a personal nature to this finding in terms of what the faculty can bring to the student experience. When it came to academic counseling, students were saying that they avoided general counseling and transfer center counseling because they didn't feel heard, seen, valued, or respected. And this finding actually dovetails with the one right underneath it about Umoja, or Black student success programs more broadly for those outside California. You might be thinking they don't necessarily have an Umoja program, although they're very common among the California community colleges. But what students were saying, what Umoja students were saying, was that the mandatory, dedicated, and proactive counseling offered by Umoja allowed them the time and space to really be themselves and be around individuals who understood their experiences and could build relationships with them. And then lastly, trying to dig into the finding around academic probation. We've done a lot of work since the release of these reports around this specific area, because what we were hearing from Black students was about the triggering nature of the word probation in and of itself in the Black community, and that receiving a notice that they're put on probation can be devastating in terms of what they have in their minds probation stands for and how they're treated when they're put on probation. On top of all of that, probation negatively impacts financial aid eligibility. And so we've had a lot of conversations since then about the need to rethink academic probation, both in terms of how it's structured, but even as simply, and I use that in quotes, as the name itself. Okay, so now we're going to move on to today's work, which is our newest phase of the research. Now, some of you might have seen what we call the third phase of the study, in which we did the statewide survey of African American and Black students across all of the California community colleges. So again, we heard from over 7,000 students. We asked a lot of questions about their experiences. These were students who had either successfully transferred in the past year or who were well on their way to transfer, had a goal or intention of transferring, but hadn't necessarily done so yet. And so we have a whole report about what students said and how that supported the prior work. However, one thing that we didn't report on at the time were on the open-ended questions from the survey. Because at the end of the day, we can look at all of these variables in the existing data sets that we have access to, and from surveys, closed-ended questions, and scales about how much you agree and you disagree. However, sometimes you just need to ask people directly what their experience was like, okay? And so for students who had already successfully transferred, that cohort of students who completed the survey, we said, okay, thinking back, before you transferred, what was the moment that you knew you were going to be successful in your goal of transfer? And then for students who were still currently enrolled, we said, what will need to happen for you to be confident that you're going to be successful in your goal of transfer? So while I said before we had 7,100 survey takers, we had about a little over 3,000 students answer this open-ended question. So then, of course, we had over 3,000 responses that we needed to dig into and code and look for themes. And when we did so, 3 core answers emerged with respect to when students said they knew they would be successful in their transfer journeys. And I'll point out that these 3 core answers did not differ with respect to students who had previously already successfully transferred and those who were on their way but had not done so yet. But before I share, I want to run a poll and see, what do you think students said their tipping point was? And now, I mentioned before, we are going to share today the clear top 3 answers. So hopefully you guys can see the results up on the screen. There seemed to be a close tie for the top 2 when they felt empowered and supported in their transfer journey and when they had a clear navigable path laid out for them. 38%, so the third most likely, was when they had their finances figured out. And then 4th, although not nearly as close, as when they did well in math. Only 4% said they always knew when they hit a certain GPA, 9% when they passed a certain class. All right, great. Moment of truth. So the top 3 answers that emerged were when students felt supported and empowered in their journey. That above and beyond was the most common response. 24% of that whole sample referenced that. When they had a clear navigable path laid out for them, 12%. And upon reaching certain academic milestones, namely maintaining a high GPA and doing well in their courses, especially math. So that one was a little bit of a trick in the poll because I took that one and I broke it into various categories, but it really was all rolled up into something academic. And I will say, when it comes to this clear navigable path laid out for them, we say 12%, but what you'll see when you read the report is there's an additional, I think it's 6%, who, we'll get into it, but they didn't have a clear navigable path. And so they just did not know. So it was the lack of the navigable path that was hindering them. So we'll get into that in a bit though. Okay, so to focus on those three core, oh, you know what? I'm going to back it up. I realized a lot of folks in the survey, in the poll, mentioned finances. And so finances, if we had to choose a fourth one, that would have been the fourth one. That one, I believe, was 8%. So it's not nothing for sure, but just wanted to call that out because for those who chose finances, that definitely is still important. All right, so authentic support and empowerment. So a number of students reference the importance of counseling. And so this really goes to support all of the other findings from this study to date, but the need for counseling that felt personal and authentic. So it wasn't enough to just go to the counselor and figure out what classes they need to take. They needed someone to feel that they were thinking of them as a person and responding as such. However, there were a subset of students who said, even though they had counseling, they had a defined educational plan, their lack of confidence stood in their way. So they just called out, like, I just don't know if I'll ever be able to do it. Here are just some quotes around authentic support and empowerment that we hope illustrate what we're trying to get at. This one here, I need to meet with an academic counselor who could speak not just to my school life, but consider my personal lifestyle as a Black mother in school. I think sums it up really well. It is about academics, that's for sure, but academics has to be seen in the context of the holistic student experience. Just some additional quotes. I mentioned before that this lack of confidence, right? And we'll get into that in the report. But you have this student here who says, I knew that I would be successful in transferring when I finally got my acceptance letters. I was worried and doubtful, but it turns out I had what it takes the whole time. So it wasn't until they had that acceptance letter in hand that they really felt that they were going to succeed. Okay. Now, second was a clear navigable path. And hopefully this figure on the right is not new, but this actually comes from earlier phases of our work and through the gate, where we looked at, this is called the Framework for Building Students' Transfer Capacity, where we identified 4 core areas that students of all races and ethnicities said impacted their transfer success. And over here, this pathway navigation really stood out. And so this is the idea that students know what their goal is in mind and have clear steps to get them to that goal. And oftentimes that comes with academic counseling, but it's not always the academic counselor who's providing that. And in the quotes, this actually really stood out because you had a lot of students saying, and I'll show some quotes in a second, oh, as soon as I sat down with my counselor and they told me I needed courses X, Y, and Z, then I knew I had it on the piece of paper, all good to go. You had other students who walked into their counselor's office and the counselor looked at their transcript and said, oh, you could have transferred last semester, or, oh, you already have all of the criteria necessary to transfer, and the transfer deadline had passed. They had no clue. They felt they were aimlessly taking courses without, they were transfer motivated, but did not know how to get there. So here are just some quotes around pathway navigation. So this is just, when I received from my counselor a clearly outlined path, listing colleges that best fit me financially, and had a strong leadership team that would support me emotionally through my journey. This idea of needing just a step-by-step process on the courses that they need to transfer, right? If I focus on this one down here, this is an example of what I was talking about and not knowing till the end. The student said, when I met with an academic counselor, I knew I would be successful in transfer when I met with an academic counselor and was informed I had nearly enough credits to complete my AA and transfer. It was a surprise as I felt I was aimlessly taking GE requirements. Okay. All right, and last but definitely not least, reaching academic milestones. So again, I mentioned it was sort of an aggregate of different things all around academics, but a number of students cited they knew they would be successful when they hit a certain GPA that was required for transfer, or that they passed a certain class. And oftentimes, not exclusively, but oftentimes they cited a specific math class. Sometimes saying that they had taken a given math class multiple times. When I finally passed XYZ math class, then I knew I had it. One student knew when they reached around 50 credits. One knew when they had the GPA that they needed to transfer. So I'll just pause and let folks read for a second. I needed to pass Math 259 with a C or better. Unfortunately, I failed the class this past semester and did not feel the professor did everything she could to teach me the material. Underneath, we hear, I was confident in the very beginning years when I first began going to college, but my confidence deteriorated when I kept failing at math and my GPA was dropping. Although I was trying my very best, life and school could never balance out for me. So this quote honestly sums up a lot of the research we've done that really just drives home the need to consider the holistic student experience, how it's so much more than academics, and school life balance plays a really big role. And you see that in the prior slides for the framework for building students' transfer capacity, wherein school life balance is one of the top 4 factors as well. Okay, so before I turn it back over to Dr. Cooper, I'm going to sum it up. So what is the tipping point? We launched this project in 2020. It's called the African American Transfer Tipping Point. We were set on finding that point where if we can just get students to that point, we're golden. Well, I hate to break it to you, but there is no singular tipping point for African American and Black students upon which they just switch from being less likely to more likely to transfer. There are so many different milestones and experiences along the way that are all intersecting with one another to cumulatively impact their success. That's not to say, all hope is not lost. Every student is different. We need to realize that all of these factors are critical, and addressing each one of them inherently is going to help students succeed. So let's discuss.
The first question, we're looking at that first item, right? That authentic support and guidance, how important it is to have that person or persons who can help you. And often the person named was a counselor, and even sometimes specifically an Umoja counselor. Shout out. So the first question I'm going to ask to both of you, with Dr. Coney going first. So what practices from Umoja can be uplifted to support students regardless of whether their campus has an Umoja program, or I would even add, or even if their campus does have an Umoja program, everybody can't be an Umoja. So what can we be doing to help more Black students?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for having me as well. Before I begin, I want to just give a big shout out to all of my Umoja colleagues across the state. Programs like Bakersfield College, Syracuse, Chaffee, San Diego City, programs that I look forward to doing great work. Chabot, Mission Santa Clara, they're doing great work. Riverside as well as San Bernardino Valley. So thank you guys for the collective work and the collective work that we all do, because it's not about me, it's about us. So with that question, I would say that all of the practices. I'm a firm believer that if you're not aware of the 18 Umoja practices, please do find that link, find that PDF, and find out ways to engage and apply those practices to your everyday practice and pedagogy. But looking forward, I think there are a few that I lean on the most in my space. And I'd like to say that intentional and deliberate is first for a reason. Everything that we do is intentional and deliberate from top to bottom. So when we think about our institutional measures and metrics, making sure that we understand the performance indicators, we understand the success indicators, and we're intentional about how we craft our programs to support those efforts. I'm a firm believer that we all make the equitable argument. Of course, DEI is under attack. It is now criminal, as my brother Jonathan Henderson stated, to do this work. So understanding that we need to push the line and make sure that these practices are intentional, they're deliberate, they're revolutionary, and that is what we do as Umoja counselors. So intentional deliberate looks like the mapping out of your courses, making sure how we're mapping out the needed resources, making sure we understand what the institutional goals are so we can be in alignment with interest convergence, right? We like to make the equitable, imperative argument. That's not working anymore. Like beating on the door, trying to argue what we should be doing and understanding the ethics of our institutions. We need to understand how what we do aligns with the bigger picture, aligns with the institutional state initiatives and even federal initiatives. So that's kind of how I would say focus on those metrics on the front end. The second thing is ethic of love. Black success is love work. Whether you know it or not, what's good for Black students is good for all students. But the question is are you giving out the love that matters the most? I'm a firm believer that any intervention depends on the inner condition of the intervener. And I'll say that again. Any intervention depends on the inner condition of the intervener, which means that a student doesn't care what you know until they know that you care. So understand that that is where we need to be at to meet students where they're at, making sure that we're dealing with those basic needs, the insecurities, all of the challenges that they face and the pull factors that come with them, and how we then put resources around that. Because contrary to popular belief, we need to move beyond the John Henryism. Like, there are no messiahs in this space. I know that a lot of us want to be the idols of Black student success, but we can't do this work alone. And there's no enemies in this space. There's no friends in this space. The people that you think that you do not need, at some point you will need to get something done. So understand that you need to move with a diplomatic approach and strategy and contingency to make sure that we're serving all students in our program. And that means making sure that we're not operating in a vacuum and in a silo, using the campus resources and the communal resources. And that's how we get to manifesting, which is also something that's very important. How are we doing? What are we doing to manifest our programs and our successes outside of the box of Umoja, on our campuses, in our communities, at our local colleges? And that is something that's very important. Lastly, I think Umoja counseling is very important. I won't really go into that because that's really what was covered, but I think that the porch is critical. We need to know what's going on, not just in our community, but in our programs across the state, making sure that who is dealing with these challenges, how do we then look at the landscape and understand how we can tweak and use live learning to improve what we're doing. And lastly, I think everybody's business and emotion is power base. This is everybody's business. This is not just us versus them. This is not those administrators. This is not, I got to fight this fight with you. Again, we have to understand that you got to plug in, you got to tap in, you got to lock in. And that's where the power base comes in. So if you are on an island and you don't know what's working somewhere else, please spend some intentionality in understanding what's happening across the landscape at other institutions and making sure that we're really coming together and holding people accountable for our students. Because again, Black student success is collective success. Just like Black history, contrary to powerful belief, is American history. So let's understand in this month that we continue to advocate, but advocate strategically, use your resources, and continue to push that needle forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coney. Crystal, please give us that student perspective.
Okay, so as Dr. Cooper said, my name is Crystal. I am an Umoja alumna. I went to Norco College, and I would say that I received a lot of support while I was there through the Umoja program. It was very holistic. When you mentioned, or when you asked Dr. Coney about the Umoja practices, I thought about how the Umoja counseling one is affirming, integrated, and intentional, because I got to see and experience support in many different ways. From the one-on-one meetings with the counselor that I had, I like to always give him a shout out. His name is Mr. Sean Davis. He was very intentional in ensuring that he built that rapport with his students, and he gave the students personalized guidance and support, because then I was able to share any struggles, any challenges I was facing. And there was also a lot of direction to the right resources. The fact that Umoja was and still is an organization that built a lot of relationships across the campus. So we had a lot of transfer readiness, which was done through collaborating with the transfer center, being informed about the different schools that you can apply to, the different requirements, being able to also know that you can walk into the transfer center, because a lot of times people don't even know what these offices are. So having a program that is showing you, if you need this, go here. This is a person that's in charge. We had Miss Natalia Service. She was the director of the transfer center, also an Umoja professor. She was very, very supportive to me while I was there. And then I also received a lot of academic support through the Umoja Village space. Umoja also did embedded tutoring. So in the classes that we we had specific tutors for that class. So they sat in the classes, they knew the material. So when you went to ask them for guidance, for support, they knew exactly how to guide you. And then we also had the peer relations, we had peer counseling. We also got support in terms of looking forward through alumni panels. So they would come back, people who went to our community college transferred would come back, and that's the Sankofa aspect, the giving back and gifting and mentoring. So they would share the experience. So we had people from UCs, CSUs, private schools come and tell us what it is like to get to that level, to what we need to do to prepare ourselves. So it was very, very holistic, and I appreciated how comfortable I felt, how seen I felt. Everything that Katie reported is exactly what a student needs to succeed, because you need to feel empowered, you need to feel like you matter, and you need to feel supported. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Love it. Love all that. I even wrote down counseling that is affirming, integrated, and intentional. Affirming, integrated, and intentional. I thought that was worth repeating. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so our next question related to that pathway navigation, I want to start with Crystal this time. So how does all of this, resonate specifically with your journey? And how did you get that path mapped out? Because it is the courses, right? It's obviously that's kind of the key part. But there's so much more to transferring than the courses, from obviously picking the universities, aligning the courses. There's all other kinds of requirements. How did you know you could afford the university? So that whole path, can you give us a little bit of insight into how you did it and who and what helped you?
Okay, so when I started at community college, I wasn't very sure about what I wanted to pursue. And so I switched around a couple of times. And I was really, really fortunate to have a counselor that was supportive, and a counselor that went out of his way to get to know me as a student, because when I was feeling that confusion and trying to figure out that clarity, he was there to guide me and even give me several options that would align with me, my interests, based on my participation in school, based on just my personality and how I am. And I would say that was the beginning of the clarity, because then I started to feel confident in my path, even beyond the classes. I started to feel some clarity in terms of what I wanted to do in my career. Now, in terms of getting to that level, having a student education plan with my counselor really helped. So we would have meetings every semester, and I would actually go to the counselor several times in a semester, just to either add things, double check, shift things around. And I would say that really, really helps, because you see all the classes that you need to take, because you can map them out ahead of time. So you can see, I need this class and this class for this semester, and so on and so forth. And based on that relationship you have with your counselor and how much they know about you, they can also guide you on, okay, you can take these classes together, you can wait and take this one later. Maybe you have a lot of things that you're navigating at this time. And that counselor wouldn't have known those things if there wasn't that relationship, if the student wasn't comfortable enough to share that, oh, I'm dealing with this or the other. So the SCP makes a big difference. And it also restores a lot of confidence, because then you also know how to pace yourself. Then there is also the assist.org website. My counselor used that to guide me in terms of looking for schools that I wanted to go to, recommending schools that had good programs or good programs for the major I was in. So assist.org, we would look up the different schools, the requirements they have, and then put those classes onto my SCP. So this all made me very confident in knowing that my path was laid out and it was going to go a certain way. I would say that also the transfer center played a huge role, because we had workshops especially when we got close to application season. We had so many workshops, people being guided, our tutors were helping students get ready for those personal insight questions that you have to submit, especially when you're doing the UC applications. So my pathway was pretty much set, and I know that that's something I appreciated a lot because it showed me how intentional the organization I was in, the program I was in, really was in ensuring that we were all succeeding and getting to where we wanted to be.
Thank you. Awesome. Dr. Coney, did you want to add anything here about how you help students navigate their transfer journey and lay out their path before we get to our next question?
Yeah, I'll be very brief because Crystal provided a lot of insight based on the great work. Shout out to Norco as well, Sean Davies, and my boy Dr. Darnell Bing. Salute. I think just to add to the background processes of that, I think that expectation has to be very intentional and very at the forefront of all of our counseling engagements. I think something that we need to make sure that we're doing, we're talking about being at the gate. You know, we even did our internal at the gate study and found out that 78% of our students were at the gate, and then we had about 38% that were near the gate, right? So once you get this information, how are we then applying it, right? And shout out to our OIE director and dean, Dr. Michelle Fowles, because we have a great relationship, and she's definitely intentional about making sure that we have all the data that we need. And when I speak about data, we have a process here at LA Valley College where we get a list of all of the Umoja students that we already have internally, but even students that might fall through the cracks, who've been flagged, who filled out the application. And then we get all multi-race Black students, because something that's very unique in our colleges, it is very hard to disaggregate for the biracial or multiracial student. It's a real problem across the state where you have Black students that are multi-dimensional or multi-race identifying, and that is typically a data point for the other in our data set. So we make sure that we're very intentional about requesting not just all Black students or all Umoja students, but all students that also identify as African American in one or more identifier races or ethnicities. And then what we do is we reach out to all of those students, and we make sure that we disaggregate down to students that do not have educational plans. And we want to make sure that every student on our campus that's Black identifying, multi-race Black adjacent, even if you don't think you're Black, but you might have chose Black as one of your identities, that you have an education plan first. Secondly to that, we want to make sure that we're then making sure students have the needed resources, and we're plugging them into the process. Something, again, when you talk about everybody's business, we need to understand the GPAs. If you're eligible for TAP honors, we want to make sure that all our students are in TAP honors. We want to make sure that all of those students are in the TAP planner. We want to make sure that we're making sure students understand the tag for UCs. We want to make sure that students are doing all the ADTs. But if you don't have that expectation or understanding on the front end and then not getting that touch, and no shade to general counseling, but it's very hard in a general context to be able to give quality counseling because of the time limitation. So therefore, students may not be able to get all that they needed because of the ratio of how many students to one counselor. It's hard to sometimes get back in. So shout out to the special populations where students can just drop in and get that information. But again, it's providing the collective. And then to further answer the question, we provide, in addition and in conjunction with our transfer center, transfer style workshops to making sure that students understand. Last fall, we did transfer Thursdays. Every Thursday, we had a transfer rep in the village space talking about the schools, the processes, scholarships, different majors, hidden majors, you know, all of the steps and processes. We do application workshops. We work closely with CCCP, and we do a lot of scholarship work as well, where we bring people that have expertise in scholarships to help students as well. So that's a part of that process. But again, lastly, I'll say that I think one challenge that I feel like I informally see on ed plans of students that might have been counseled somewhere else is that there's this process for some reason where we think that and I think it's deficit minded or focused, that we think that African American students should not have math on their ed plan in the first year. I think that's one of the bigger travesties. People come in and say they're not good at math. They haven't taken math in 2 or 3 years, but for some reason the logic is, well, I'll wait the first year and warm up to it. But again, you're further away from whatever you learned previously. So the way that our program is set up, we have Stat 101, Math 227, and Math 238, which is Math Calc, all in the first year, first semester. We've been awarded, and we're 12 students away from having no DI on this campus. And the only area that we're working on is making sure that we get 12 more students through the math pipeline. So again, that's about the intentionality of how we can do our courses, how we can map out, like I said, controlling the pathway, making sure that out of all of our now 15 courses in Umoja here at LA Valley College, that we're making sure that we're hitting those key GEs. We're using live learning to then expand that pipeline to accommodate other fringe students that might be doing kinesiology or nursing, to make sure they can move together in a cohort fashion for bio and anatomy and all of those other hard classes. And we have embedded tutors in all of our classes and in the village. So those are the supports that we're providing that are intentionally not just keeping them on their path, but in the spirit, of our campus and our matriculation, making sure they get through as well in alignment with guided pathways. So thank you.
You're doing a lot.
we are doing a lot.
Yeah,
And
you can be plural.
yes. And the last thing that I will add in this is that, to that point, success teams are important. I know some of us might have some version of that, an advisory committee for Umoja, but again, the composition and strategy for those success teams are very important. Sometimes we just want to do with all the Black folks, and sometimes those Black folks might be high in number, but not high in legitimate power, right? So making sure that you integrate your success teams to make sure that you have administrators at multi-levels, you have key people in academic support, key people in financial aid, key people in admissions. So when you have these issues, there's a collective response of everybody's business that's dealing with the challenges of our students. Because again, we all know that a lot of students apply, but not many make it to census. So how can we then, pay attention to that gap in those first 3 to 4 or 5 weeks from application to census to make sure students are not falling through the cracks?
You bring up an excellent point, and something I've brought up before. Like, we don't do a lot of research on anybody who doesn't make it past census. We just don't, and that's not an RP thing. It's not a California thing. That's a nationwide thing. Not to say that there's none of that research, but we tend to not focus on those students, and they come or they don't come in those first interactions, and really honing in on what that is. That's another kind of project I would love to see, is almost like a reverse of this one, where we look at the people who didn't make it to census, right? Or didn't make it to that for even the first day of class. But I'm getting off topic. We do have one more question. We have 10 minutes and we have some things we want to close out with. So I'm going to ask you to keep your answer to, maybe 3-ish minutes. But this last one about these academic milestones, and this one is for Dr. Coney. Again, from your perspective as a counselor or coordinator, what are the challenges that you see coming up most often for students in terms of making that transfer milestone? And I think you've mentioned some of these strategies that you've been employing.
So similar to what I kind of already communicated, I think the challenges and barriers or lack of information or knowledge of navigation, I think that there's a lot of disconnect too from front-end services like Welcome Center and Outreach, to make sure that we make those soft handoffs to the special programs for Black students, whether or not people are comfortable or uncomfortable saying like, oh, hey, are you Black? Maybe the Umoja program might be a great program, but I think that should be one of the major steps and processes on our campus. We have a general understanding that if there's any African-American student, whether you mention it to the student or not, I am to get some type of referral via email, or someone on my team is to get a referral to follow up with any student that's met in general counseling, outreach, Welcome Center, any Saturday registration event. And that is really what helps us keep our numbers up, right? I mean, loosely, we serve about 300 students, but like nuclearly, and students that are really in our data, we serve in our cohort classes, in our cohort, about 160 to 220 annually. So that is a part of a collective. That's not just me being able to do that, but there's also intentionality in the outreach at the LA USD North High Schools. So when we think about the challenges specifically outside of the lack of knowledge, as I stated, making sure that students have an education plan, making sure stuff is mapped out, making sure students are spending exploratory opportunities in that first semester in counseling courses, and making sure they know that their career is the right one for them, or if they need to pivot early and not later. And I think that another barrier too is just really having mentorship in this space in the process. Again, I think that Black success is like hygiene. Either you smell good or you don't. There's a lot of people that, think that they're good in this space, or act like they're good in this space, whether it's self-aggrandizing or other spaces, but this is not a stepping stone or a springboard. We're really about Black success. And to do that, it takes all of us. And we just need to remove the barriers, making sure that basic needs is met, and moving that forward as well. So I think that pretty much covers it for us. I don't think there's a lot other that hasn't really been said, and again, most of us are the choir. We're already doing some of the good work, but those are just some of the things that work well at our campus, just advisory, making sure that we mapped out, a whole first year FYE program for our students, getting them to the second year and making sure that that semester to semester and summer and spring to fall semester persistence is there, because it's very hard sometimes to keep them over the summer drain and melt. So that's it for us.
Well, I said, thank you. So, I mean, if people didn't get some ideas, I don't know, maybe they weren't listening.
Yeah,
So
I got more.
I know
Catch me
you
in a
do.
minute.
But we have 8 minutes, and,
Yeah, no worries.
I'm calling an audible in spirit of the Super Bowl.
Call me.
I'm calling an audible. As I was listening to both Dr. Coney and Crystal and thinking about this, I realized that I wanted to ask Crystal, what was your tipping point?
My tipping point was when I got to community college and realized how intentional the Umoja team was in presenting and providing resources and ensuring that we all felt supported. I'm going to keep referring to Umoja because Umoja does amazing work. It's undeniable, it's very clear. And we had all-round support, not just the counselors. We had a student success coach. Outside of the counseling, you could go and have these conversations with your student success coach. I remember having a conversation with mine at the time, Anita Bailey, shout out to her. She enabled me to figure out that I wasn't satisfied with the major I was in and that I needed to switch. That if we hadn't had that conversation, I probably would have graduated in a major that I didn't want to be in. And we had even the professors provided such amazing support, having accessible professors and counselors in village space, because village space is the place that the students would go get tutoring, sit down and study, but we also knew that we could access the counselors and the professors there. So just seeing how everyone was making themselves present and how everyone was ensuring that we had everything we needed so that we could succeed, that was my tipping point. That's when I knew I was going to make it.
Thank you for sharing that. So appreciative. I know for some of you, this may have sounded like an infomercial for Umoja, and perhaps on some level it is. If your college does not have an Umoja program, you may want to look into that. Again, that's wasn't necessarily our end goal with this presentation, but I think it has to be said. And if you do have an Umoja program, I think, like I said, Dr. Coney and Crystal have shared a lot about what makes a really great Umoja experience for students and a program that helps students be successful. So you've got some resources there. All right, I'm going to power through. I got 5 minutes to get through the rest of these slides. So in the report, we have these recommendations in terms of increasingly personalized student support. If you didn't get that message from our two guests, again, I'm not sure you were listening to, improving pathway navigation, the clarity of that pathway. I mean, some of these are very obvious. This one, recognize and celebrate student success. I don't think we all do a good enough job of that until, graduation. But there are so many milestones, so many tipping points that should be celebrated and reinforced, and just letting students know you're good, you're making it, you're making progress. Let's celebrate that. And then obviously academic support, helping students get through math, helping students get that GPA that they want, but making sure that we're surrounding them with those supports. So here is the QR code. The next slide has an infographic. There's also a QR code there. This takes the graphic that was at the beginning with the arrows going this way and the arrows going that way. We basically just put that in a little more human way, where you can see the students who are kind of heading towards the gate, and then you've got students who are heading away from the gate. And this is where I always emphasize for our low-income students and our disabled students, it's not about them, it's about their circumstance. And remember, with this particular statistic, we are comparing students who are to students who are not. So we are comparing students who have a disability to students who do not. And so in that comparison, the students with a disability are 20% less likely because of the challenges. And the same thing goes with the students from a low income background. All right, the next slide. I told you at the beginning, this wasn't the first report. This is the fifth thing that we have released. All of that is on the webpage. These just the pictures so that you can see. There's a QR code. Just want to give a shout out to my colleagues at Career Ladders Project. If you happen to be in the Riverside area, we're going to be having a convening looking at student-centered counseling. A lot of the principles that we are talking about here and how important counseling is and what kind of counseling. Again, you heard from both of our guests that how important it is for that counseling to be personalized, to develop those relationships. The tipping point is the latest research that we've done that keeps coming back to this finding. Students want relationships, not transactions. We'll say it again. Students want relationships, not transactions. Thank you. We did have a couple of questions in the chat. Katie was going to answer those verbally, so I'm going to let her do that, and then we'll say goodbye.
What impact, if any, did culturally responsive pedagogy and practices of instructors in Black student classes have on student success and persistence to transfer? I'm actually going to point you to this report here because it actually has some really interesting findings around microaggressions in the classroom. Or no, let me back it up. Microaggressions and students' experiences with microaggressions and how that influences their likelihood of passing transfer level math and English. And I'm just pointing that out briefly because we have presented the findings from this report here in conjunction with Ed Equity Solutions, which put out a report. It's called Counting on Math Faculty, Examining the Role of Faculty and Instructional Practices in Students' Gateway Math Success. And so if you read that report, in conjunction with this report, I think you'll find that because we did not dig into specific pedagogical practices, but they did, you can see how those things interplay with one another. And so definitely encourage you to read both reports. Again, it's by Dr. Meena Dadgar and her colleagues from Educational Equity Solutions, Counting on Math Faculty. So definitely check that out.
Thank you again for coming. Hope to see you next time. Thank you.